Oh yeah, watch.
Or 5 p.m. and the Finnish court session began late at around 12:45 p.m. and the government's lawyer surprised Simon Ekpa'S legal team by requesting to bring 10 witnesses, though the judge allowed only 3 for the day due to time constraints. The first witness, code-named T1, was introduced and identified as Simon Ekpa'S' immediate neighbor in Finland, claiming to have shared a garden and observed disturbing activities at Simon Ekpa'S' residence. T1 described frequent gatherings, noise, and suspicious behavior from visitors to Simon Ekpa'S' home, including one instance where guests allegedly banged on the witness's door and made threats. The government's lawyer used a previous media interview from 2023 where T1 had spoken about Simon Ekpa'S' behavior and emphasized the word "woto promax," which T1 claimed Simon Ekpa used as a code for violence or threat. The lawyer presented tweets, videos, and forum discussions where "woto promax" appeared, arguing it was slang used by Simon Ekpa and his alleged group to incite or signal violence, and tying it to his pro-Biafra rhetoric. During cross-examination, Simon Ekpa'S' lawyer pressed T1 with yes or no questions, exposing that T1 had no video evidence and only an unverifiable audio recording, which T1 could not prove wasn't AI generated. Simon Ekpa'S' lawyer discredited T1 further by revealing that in 2021, the same witness had testified in a different case where the accused was eventually acquitted, suggesting a pattern of unreliable testimony. The courtroom reacted strongly to this revelation, and Simon Ekpa'S' lawyer ended his cross-examination, having significantly undermined the credibility of the witness. The judge called for a short break, after which the session resumed briefly, with more legal exchanges and debate between the two counsels. The court session ended with the announcement that a second witness would testify tomorrow, someone identified as a close family member of Simon Ekpa, setting the stage for a potentially dramatic day. On the 28th day of May in the year 2025, something very significant unfolded in a Finnish courtroom, and it involved a man whose name is Simon Ekpa. Simon Ekpa is widely known by many across different continents, especially in Africa and Europe, for his involvement in the struggle for the independence of the indigenous people of Biafra. He often identifies himself as the Prime Minister of the Biafra Republic government in exile, and because of this, he has attracted not only global attention, but also intense scrutiny, particularly from governments who believe his words and actions have crossed legal and ethical lines. On this particular day, the courtroom was filled with tension, anticipation, and a sense of unfolding drama. The session began later than scheduled. By the time it was fully underway, it was already 12:45 in the afternoon. The delay in the start time meant that everyone present already anticipated that something unusual was about to take place. The air in the courtroom was heavy, not only because of the delay, but because it was the third day of an increasingly dramatic and controversial legal process. When the court finally came to order, the lawyer representing the Finnish government stepped forward. He had come prepared. What made this moment particularly intense was not just the usual legal proceedings, but the announcement he made almost immediately after summarizing the events of the previous day, which was the 27th of May in the year 2025. After presenting his summary, the government lawyer requested something that caught even Simon Ekpa'S' defense team by surprise. He asked the judge if he could bring 10 witnesses to testify against Simon Ekpa. This request startled many. Witnesses in such cases are often carefully selected and their testimonies heavily scrutinized. Bringing 10 in a single day was extraordinary. The presiding judge, recognizing that time was limited because of the late start, responded to the lawyer's request by stating that 10 witnesses would be too many for the day's session. The judge, however, did permit the government lawyer to present 3 witnesses. The courtroom quieted in expectation as everyone waited to see who these 3 witnesses would be and what they would say. The first witness the government lawyer presented was identified not by name, but by a code name, T1. For clarity, this could be interpreted to mean Testifier 1. While the real identity of T1 was protected, what became quickly evident was that T1 was not a stranger to Simon Ekpa. T1 was introduced as Simon Yoku Ekpa'S immediate neighbor. This was someone who lived very close to him in Finland, someone who claimed to share a garden with him, and someone who had previously spoken to the Finnish media in the year 2023 about what he or she claimed to have witnessed. As T1 took the stand, the government lawyer began by referencing a specific interview that T1 had given to a media outlet in Finland called Ekpa'S. This interview, dated February the 23rd, 2023, had already been reported publicly and was now being used as part of the government's case. In that interview, T1 described what he or she called strange and disturbing behaviors coming from Simon Yoku Ekpa'S residence. The witness described frequent gatherings at Simon Yoku Ekpa'S home, often accompanied by loud noise, suspicious visitors, and what T1 called threatening behavior. T1 even recounted an incident where visitors from Simon Yoku Ekpa'S residence allegedly banged on the witness's door and made threats. T1 claimed that living near Simon Yoku Ekpa felt scary and intimidating. The witness alleged that Africans, particularly Nigerians, frequently visited Simon Yoku Ekpa'S residence. Some of these gatherings, according to T1, were calm, while others were noisy and chaotic. The witness told the court that one specific incident stood out. When a man, who T1 believed was one of Simon Yoku Ekpa'S guests, came to the witness's door and banged loudly, issuing what the witness perceived as a threat. Since that moment, T1 claimed to have lived in constant fear. The government lawyer took this testimony further by suggesting that Simon Yoku Ekpa'S behavior and activities might be more than just disruptive. The lawyer then asked a very pointed question. Could Simon Yoku Ekpa lead a terror group? T1 responded that it was very likely. This statement immediately prompted an objection from Simon Yoku Ekpa'S lawyer, who argued that such a question was speculative and prejudicial. However, the presiding judge overruled the objection, allowing the answer to stand as part of the official testimony. At this point, the atmosphere in the courtroom became even more charged. The government lawyer then introduced another element into the testimony: language and slang allegedly used by Simon Yoku Ekpa. T1 claimed that Simon Yoku Ekpa often spoke in both Finnish and Nigerian languages and used a particular phrase that T1 interpreted as a call for violence. This phrase was "woto woto promax." According to T1, this term was often used by Simon Yoku Ekpa and his guests in ways that suggested it was a code for danger or harm. The government lawyer, trying to establish the seriousness of the phrase, presented tweets, videos, and online discussions where this exact term, "woto woto promax," appeared. The lawyer argued that in Nigerian slang, "woto woto" means to deal with someone harshly, often violently, and that the addition of promax intensified its meaning. The lawyer even cited discussions from a Nigerian online forum called Nairaland, where users described woto woto as a way of referring to beating someone, harming someone, or unleashing violent consequences. The government lawyer linked this term back to a tweet that Simon Yoku Ekpa allegedly posted on the first day of January in the year 2023. In the tweet, Simon Yoku Ekpa used the phrase "woto woto promax" with speed and referred to 2023 as the year of Biafran liberation and exit from Nigeria. According to the lawyer, this tweet, coupled with the slang, suggested a call to arms, or at the very least, an incitement to violence. At the conclusion of the government lawyer's examination, T1 had painted a picture of Simon Yoku Ekpa as someone who was feared in his own neighborhood, who hosted disturbing gatherings, and who allegedly used coded language to communicate threats. However, what followed was perhaps the most dramatic part of the day. Now it was time for Simon Yoku Ekpa'S defense lawyer to cross-examine T1. And what unfolded next completely changed the tone of the courtroom. The defense lawyer began with a series of straightforward yes or no questions. He asked T1 if there was any personal relationship between the witness and Simon Yoku Ekpa. T1 answered no. He asked whether T1's family had any connection to Simon Yoku Ekpa. Again, the answer was no. When asked whether T1 had ever seen Simon Yoku Ekpa with weapons or harming someone, T1 replied no. This began to chip away at the image of Simon-Yoku Ekpa as someone dangerous or violent. Then the defense lawyer tackled the most controversial part of T1's testimony, the audio recording that allegedly captured Simon-Yoku Ekpa giving threatening instructions. The lawyer asked T1 whether the recording was a video or just audio. T1 confirmed it was only audio. Then came the critical question: could T1 prove that the audio was not generated using artificial intelligence? The witness hesitated. The defense lawyer insisted on a yes or no answer. T1 eventually admitted that no, he or she could not prove the audio was authentic. The courtroom reacted with a mix of murmurs and shock. But the defense lawyer did not stop there. He then revealed that this same witness, T1, had testified in another case back in the year 2021. In that earlier case, the person T1 testified against was found not guilty. This revelation caused a stir in the courtroom. The implication was that T1 had a history of giving unreliable testimony. When asked whether this was true, T1 confirmed it was. This sequence of questions and revelations caused a major shift in the courtroom atmosphere. What had started as a damning testimony from a neighbor now seemed riddled with doubts, inconsistencies, and a lack of concrete evidence. The defense lawyer ended the cross-examination, having cast significant doubt on the credibility of the government's first witness. After this intense exchange, the presiding judge called for a short break. Everyone needed a moment to digest what had just happened. When the session resumed, the legal teams engaged in more procedural discussions, but the energy in the room had shifted. There was now a growing sense that the case was far more complicated than it first appeared. At the end of the day's proceedings, the judge announced that the trial would continue the next day. The second witness scheduled to testify was identified as a close family member of Simon-Yoku Ekpa. This announcement added a new layer of suspense. If the first witness had been a neighbor, the next could potentially offer even deeper insights, or perhaps bring even more controversy. The courtroom emptied slowly, with observers and legal experts exchanging whispers and predictions. Outside the courthouse, members of the public, reporters, and supporters of both sides were waiting for updates. Some believed the day had damaged the government's case significantly. Others felt it was too soon to draw conclusions. What is clear is that the trial of Simon-Yoku Ekpa is not just a legal matter. It is a political and emotional story. It touches on issues of freedom of speech, political activism, national security, and the right of a people to determine their own future. Simon-Yoku Ekpa is not an ordinary figure. His words carry weight, and his actions have inspired both hope and fear, depending on whom you ask. As the courtroom prepares for the next day of testimony, all eyes will be on the person described as a close family member. What this person says, and how believable their words are, could play a pivotal role in shaping the outcome of this case. For now, though, the events of the 28th of May will remain a powerful chapter in what is quickly becoming one of the most closely watched legal battles in modern European-African relations. As the doors of the courtroom closed behind the observers and the legal teams began gathering their documents and conferring quietly among themselves, it became evident that what had transpired on the 28th day of May in the year 2025 was more than a typical day in a Finnish courtroom. The story was unfolding with the complexity of a historical trial, not only concerning Simon-Yoku Ekpa as a man, but also echoing the voices, struggles, and fears of millions of people who see in him either a champion of self-determination or a dangerous instigator of unrest. While the world outside the courtroom was digesting the explosive testimony from the first witness, known only as T1, analysts and legal commentators in Finland and Nigeria were already offering interpretations. Some called the day's revelations a masterstroke by the defense, while others warned that the Finnish government was still in the early stages of revealing the depth of its evidence. Regardless of interpretation, one fact stood out with clarity. Simon-Yoku Ekpa's defense team had succeeded in casting reasonable doubt on the testimony of a witness who had been presented as a neighbor, a victim, and possibly a first-hand observer of Simon-Yoku Ekpa's behavior. Late into the evening of the same day, across various media platforms in Nigeria and Finland, conversations intensified in parts of Enugu, Imo, Abia, and Anambra, regions where Simon-Yoku Ekpa's name is known as well as that of any prominent politician. People gathered in beer parlors, barbershops, and village squares to listen to radio programs or watch television analysis of the events in Finland. Some clapped in approval as they heard that Simon Ekpa'S lawyer had exposed inconsistencies in the neighbor's testimony. Others shook their heads solemnly, convinced that no matter what the Finnish court decided, the tension in southeastern Nigeria would continue as long as Simon Ekpa kept issuing orders from abroad. Meanwhile, in Finland, many were watching the case unfold with a mixture of curiosity, concern, and bewilderment. Some Finnish citizens were now learning for the first time that a man living in their country, a naturalized Finnish citizen of Nigerian origin, had become the leader of a controversial movement pushing for the secession of Biafra from Nigeria.
You know, Siam, and they have had, yes,